everybody, and thank you for joining us for this week's Diving Deeper. As you can see, we're doing things a little bit differently this week, although we've done it before, but we're back on Zoom for this week. And the reason being is I'm out for a family wedding in California. So taking a little break from the Arizona desert, but happy to be joining you, Pastor Dave, for our Diving Deeper this week. And
Good to be with you, Ernie, and I hope you guys are having a great time out there.
It is going well, and we're having a good time so far. And I understand that this week we're continuing our journey through the characters of the Passion story. And so last week we took a look at Judas. This week we're taking a look at Peter. And I know in your sermon you talked about Peter, and you also kind of extrapolated that to, making it relatable to how Peter failed, like having failures in our life, and the failures that we might experience as we go through the different chapters of our lives. And one of the things that you touched on that I really found kind of like a keystone of your sermon, if you will, is just kind of dealing with the contradictions that come in our lives, and how can we better deal with our contradictions in our lives, especially when we talk about our faith life. And so what would you say is a key, or not a key, but a good answer to that question in terms of being able to deal with sometimes those heady contradictions?
Sure. Yeah, Peter is a fascinating character for us around this. And I know we've touched on this a bit before about how the disciples are people who are striving to learn this way of Jesus, and they often fall flat on their faces. I mean, they often have a very difficult time doing what Jesus has asked of them, and that's part of the good news for us, is that if they falter and fail, we know we will too. But just like they were able to rise up from that, and with God's help and with Jesus's help, they were able to go forward, and the same is true for us. I like the image of being a walking contradiction. I mean, I think that fits us probably more than we like to admit.
Sure.
We have these tensions within us between being faithful and being forgetful about our faith. The tension between what's striving to do good and to follow God's will in our lives, and where we just fall drastically short of that, or we feel like I keep trying and I can't quite get this right. It is very hard to forgive. It is very hard to love this person who is so difficult. It is hard for me to be faithful to God every day of the week, or I don't pray often enough, and so the part of the tension around that is Christianity can become a massive guilt trip, and we probably all have felt that at some time, and I don't think that's the reason Jesus came.
Right.
Jesus wanted to be redemptive, offer redemptive love into our lives, and so we have to learn to face our contradictions, and in a sense be both at home with them, and to allow God to work through them to bring us out of those contradictions, but also to recognize that is part of our humanity, and so maybe, and this may be kind of almost like a counterintuitive Zen move or something. The way out may be the way in. The way in may be the way out, kind of a thing. As we move into our contradictions, we find that in those places where we really struggle, like Peter did, but that's where God is going to show up. And Peter has the most spectacular failure of any disciple in the New Testament. I mean, there's probably no other way to describe it. Judas does this terrible act of betrayal and then ends his life. So the tragedy is doubly compounded there. Peter denies Jesus, just outright lies when he's asked if he was with Jesus, if he was a follower. And he says, I don't even know the man, kind of thing. And he does that publicly. And again, one of those fascinating places where the Bible shows us how these characters have immense failure, and where their faith falls so short. And it tells us in one of the Gospels how Jesus turns and looks at Peter after he says this. So he's caught in his lie,
Right.
and so I'm sure his heart was absolutely shattered by then. But in that experience, God was also able to take that failure and rebuild Peter again to be the leader, not only of the disciples, but the emerging leader of the early church. God works in those moments in such powerful ways for us. And so as painful as they are, that it becomes an entry point for God to do some significant work in us.
And I like that you're phrasing it that way, Pastor Dave, because I think too often as we go through our lives, when we come, face to face, or we struggle with these contradictions, that dot are who we are, in our character. Sometimes we look at them in a negative light, and I think it's easy to do that, kind of like what's wrong with me, what's wrong with the situation,
Yes.
like how am I, how, you kind of beat yourself up.
Beat yourself up. We do that easily. Yes.
And I think what you're saying about how it actually, and again, kind of with most of our faith, or our journey in walking in faith, when you look back, you see that's when God shows up. And I think that's true. And I like that you're saying that is where God does some of his best work, is when we're caught up in that contradiction and we're struggling with it. And that leads me really to the second question I have for this week, which was, in your opinion, how do you feel, or how would you say our imperfection really binds us to God?
Sure. Yeah, that's a fascinating thing to think about, because most of us don't like to look too much at our imperfections. We know we have them, but it's hard to look in the mirror, I think, and to see ourselves saying, like, here's where I'm not as good a person as I want to be, or I'm not as consistently living out this life that Jesus wants me to live, or I get short-tempered, or I'm falling on my face here, or I'm not being as honest as I could be in my relationships, or
right.
I'm not being as loving as I think I can be, or as God wants me to be. But maybe it is in those imperfections, when we are willing, with God's help, to look at them, it becomes a place where we recognize our need for God. And I think that's a way that our imperfections can bind us to God. And I think Jesus was all about that. Jesus wasn't going around looking for perfect people. That's not the way he put the disciples together. That wasn't the kind of movement he was building. He was looking for people, or trying to help people to be receptive to the movement of God in their lives, and so to the movement of the Spirit that could bring us closer to God, and closer to our authentic selves, where God can work and recreate us. We talk about how Jesus begins a renewal movement in Israel. Jesus begins a renewal movement in every person that he encountered, and so we all need our perfections. We need to be renewed out of our imperfections, and it's not like we dismiss them or live in denial of them. Maybe we're freed from that tendency towards denial, to say I'm not as bad as I think I am, or that thing, the way I treat the other members of my family, or I treat my kids or my spouse, I just I don't have to worry about that. But God is saying, no, you do, and there is a way out of this as well too. There is a way to be renewed, so that a relationship can be healthier, or be life-giving, or so that you can be freed from places where life has pulled you down, where addiction has taken hold in you, where you have habits that are pulling you backward, or leaving you feeling trapped. And God really wants to be able to work in those places, and God can absolutely do that. And we have to let go a bit. I mean, I think that's always the part of the internal struggle, so that we can take that step. As God is stepping towards us, we can step towards God. It's almost like a two-step dance movement there, if I can make that analogy.
True. Very, very applicable. A little bit different than the Arizona two-step, but it's two-step.
Probably so.
So, well, that's great. I think that'll wrap this discussion up for this week. But I've got to say, so far, 2 characters in, I've really enjoyed what you've shared with us so far with Judas and now with Peter. And I'm looking forward to, kind of unpacking the other characters we're going to be taking a look at in the next few weeks as we journey towards Easter. So I hope all of you will tune in, not just for diving deeper, but for our services every week, and then come back and watch the diving deeper that goes along with it, so you can hear Pastor Dave unpack it a little bit further for you. That said, thank you for joining us this week, and we'll see you next week.